Committee on Sustainability. Do you want to start with your presentation, and then we possibly do a pause after that and just wrap up on this last sustainability comments before we go into technology and the others? Thanks.
Sure. Well, good morning again. This is a good opportunity for us to update you on our work. You did say 2 topics, but I always like to start with some reflections. So this meeting sort of marks my 5-year anniversary in this role, which means either way you choose it, I'm either well beyond halfway done or just past halfway done with my term. So, but it gives a really moment of reflection on what's been accomplished, how much more we need to have, but also to reflect on where we are as a board in terms of our strategy and work plan. And I really do think we're near an inflection point at this moment, because by the time you get to the end of this year or early next year, we will approve what I've been calling our big 3 standards out the door: sustainability in September, going concern in December, and fraud in March. And while fraud and going concern are not on this agenda today, specifically, I just wanted to highlight that we see them very much on track and staying aligned with our core principles that we had in the exposure draft, though we are benefiting greatly from the comment letters. And in this very room, 2-3 weeks ago, we were discussing the going concern comment letters and the impacts on our proposals for that. Then once we get those, and we'll talk sustainability shortly, once we get those standards out the door, you know, we get to a much more forward-looking, future-looking state for audit, and just thinking about technology and whatever offshoots arise from that. Our integrated approach to risk assessment, audit evidence, and other 500 series matters, materiality, and other topics that arise, in addition to spending some time to allow people to implement the series of standards and how we will go about supporting them. So I really do want to highlight how significant of a point in our history we are as a board, and like these are really important public interest issues we're addressing, but we'll start getting more forward-looking going forward. So we talked about 5,000. We are near the finish line, as you know, but it's worth reminding everyone what we set out to do, which is to get the highest quality sustainability specific standard that could serve as a global baseline, be leading in thought, but also be adopted in as many jurisdictions as possible. To me, this was always a constrained optimization exercise. We were not going to have a full book of ISSAs like we have ISAs on day one, but we wanted to have a robust framework in place that would give users of sustainability reported information confidence that it had appropriate assurance. And so a number of constraints or factors have governed our approach to timing, the scope of standards, what's in and what's out, and how we've designed it. And you know, we're clearly aware of IOSCO's recommendations, EU timelines, other timelines that national standard setters have underway. Because remember, this is not being done in isolation. This is being done in large part because either the ISSB standards, S1, S2 are being adopted, or some other regional specific requirements happen. We also are very conscious of the complexity of adopting or implementing a performance standard of the size that we have, the methodologies that have to be developed to do it. Remember, this is a profession agnostic standard. Many practitioners will not have used IASA 3000, which this is built on, so we want to give a maximum amount of time, considering the fact that requirements will be in place largely by 2026 in many jurisdictions. And we also were conscious that this is an overarching standard, so not everything can be fit into the standard, but make a commitment to support the standard throughout. So we've talked a little bit about the coordination at the last session. Our task forces, these are still task force driven projects, are meeting. They're meeting in next week in London, our task force, to go over the feedback we received at the June board meeting and also to reflect on the coordination efforts. We will have a July board call on the 24th to cover some of the more challenging issues that were left over from June. We will also have in September a full read of the standards and an opportunity for potentially further coordination, and we will approve 5,000. We are on track. I don't see any impediments to being on track. Just to be clear, we are continuing our engagement. We had an engagement with the CAOB last week where, Paul, you should hear, we have timing for IOSCO C1 engagement, which we've committed to. Just the question is how much work we've done, particularly, as I said in the last discussion, the whole group engagement area is the most challenging from a technical perspective, working through that. We will continue working with key stakeholders throughout. So where are we? In March, you can see the issues that were brought to our board. In June, we went back to the preconditions, estimates and forward-looking information, dealt with fraud, communications, and reporting. And we had a full read of the standard. So, I think people were feeling like we're getting to the point of refinement more than anything else. We talked a little bit about this in the last session, but it does address one of the concerns that this group has expressed at our last meeting about this third track, sort of the self-determined fulfillment of quality management and ethical requirements. And we've gotten rid of that third track. Through some drafting, we're able to bring more coordination with IASB, highlight IASB's work better, but also eliminate this idea that you would be self-creating and self-evaluating. And both for quality management and also relevant ethical requirements. And, I think at the end of the day, we just couldn't figure out where there's a process where something wouldn't be approved by an appropriate authority in this instance. So I think that was a point that I wanted to get back to on you, because it does deal with a coordination concern that IASB is, but more importantly too, it deals with a public interest concern expressed at this meeting.
And I'll chip in here. I don't normally want to do that, but when we prepared, we were very happy, comfortable to see that feedback from Mark, who was our observer. And I don't think there's anybody happier than Janine. You made her feel a little bit better despite them losing the football last night. So Janine, it was a point that I know you felt strongly about, and I do think it solves a lot of potential risks that she also pointed out to us and that we saw there. So well done. Yeah.
So, and then, on materiality, clearly a focused area of us. We've helped clarify some of the language in it. As you can see on the slide, the entity's process to identify sustainability information to be reported, and then more clarity in the standards of what that means. This would be the so-called materiality process that is highlighted in some jurisdictions. And then we provided, speaking of hooks, the concept of double materiality, conditional requirement, and application material. Now, this is not about the practitioner in determining, but it's how an assurance practitioner deal. I mean, it's not about a preparer, but how the assurance practitioner does their appropriate work in a double materiality context. We are not opining on reporting frameworks. This is a conditional requirement. We have conditional requirements. We are framework neutral still. If we turn to the next element, as I said in the last discussion, the group engagement using the work of others is our biggest outstanding issue for refinement. I imagine, and Billy could confirm, that this is probably a big matter for task force discussion next week, into place for continued engagement with IAASB. We are clarifying reported boundary components and the distinctions between group components and value chain components. The one thing I would say is that this is just not as easy as the world of financial reporting, because you could get an instance in which you're getting information from another practitioner, which we will think is rare, but may not be assurance, typical assurance work, and that will be incorporated. So we're working through these issues. I don't want to opine upon where we land, other than we're very sensitive about the very technical components in this issue, and that we'll certainly have in discussions with IAASB and others as we go forward. Vili, anything more you want to say about where the task force is on that topic?
Yeah, thank you, Tom. So specifically on the second bullet point there, where IAASB C1 raised a concern around the possibility that another practitioner could potentially perform work on a component, on a group component. I think we all accept that in relation to value chain components, that would be fine, and that would occur quite often. But when we discussed this at our board meeting in June, particularly one of our board members that does this as part of his day job says that this does actually happen in practice, that you just can't, in this environment where you deal with such a variety of information, you just can't anticipate that you won't come across a situation where you get into the assurance engagement and you find out, for example, that another practitioner during the course of the year, because one of the business units had to review a water license with some regulatory authority, that work on certain items, and that information is now relevant with respect to the information that is subject to the assurance engagement. And we have to understand that even when you use the work of another practitioner, you still have to do the work. I mean, you can't just accept the report that they issue. So what we are trying to do here is to clearly, and you will see that in the draft, and we'll discuss that at the Sustainability Task Force meeting next week, is we are now going to be stronger by saying that there is a presumption that when work is done in relation to a component practitioner, there is a presumption that the sustainability assurance practitioner can be sufficiently and appropriately involved in that work. However, we also recognize the reality that you may still come across, especially the first time you come across this, that there's work that was already done by another practitioner, and you might want to use that work to obtain audit evidence for purposes of your assurance engagement. In that case, that practitioner will be another practitioner, and like I said, you still have to go and do the work in the context of paragraphs 51 to 54 that sets out how do you get comfortable with that work. However, we're also building in a second presumption that says next year you know about this practitioner. So if that practitioner is going to continue to do that work in subsequent years, again, there's the presumption that you will be able to then be sufficiently and appropriately involved. It's just to create that bridge that There might simply be work that was done and you didn't, the entity probably didn't realize it at that point. You were not aware of it. You didn't have an opportunity to be able to access that practitioner, to coordinate with them, to get their cooperation, etc. But we believe if we put those two presumptions in, we put enough boundaries around this to contain the occurrence of this, where another practitioner performs work in relation to a group component.
And the reason, remember, we're very sensitive to the point that was raised, is that we did not want to create effectively an arbitrage or a lower bar here where people push to claim things were another practitioner rather than part of the group engagement team. And so hopefully in the next week or so, we'll have further clarity on it, conscious of the dynamics. This is an area we are particularly sensitive that has overlapping implications with the ethics side as well. Okay, so I'm going to go quickly through the other topics and then leave it open for discussion. On preconditions, really what we're trying to do, one of the things that is that people wanted to make sure that the work effort was appropriately calibrated, presumed to the absence of an indication contrary, that criteria, reporting frameworks that are embodied in law or regulation or established by authorized or recognized organizations are deemed as suitable criteria. IAASB would be one, GRI would be another. Like, we're not going to opine on whether it, but that would be examples. Something like CSRD, people wanted us to be much more clear about that. Also, same type of point on rational purpose for engagement required by law or regulation. We are dealing with estimates and forward-looking information as one still. We did a comparison with 3410, added some application materials about estimates and forward-looking information. And also being really clear about what the role of the practitioner is in this instance, and not saying that the practitioner is supposed to obtain evidence about the outcome of forward-looking information. So this is another point where we focused on at our last meeting. Let's get to fraud. I don't picture us much change in the standard on fraud. It's not a full fraud standard. We were very clear not to have a specific definition of greenwashing. That's been something we heard in our comment period. It's also consistent with IAASB's approach. We're going to add principles to address management bias and potential management bias. This goes to communication. In fact, I raised it at the board meeting that there's going to be a requirement to communicate fraud or no CLAR. This is oftentimes this is in the code, but I found it was really strange in our previous draft that the only obligation to report was to management, who could be the party creating the no CLAR situation or fraud. So that will be put into our requirements as well. And we're going to add more application material here. And then reporting, you can see what we're planning on doing here, and we're adding transparency about relevant ethical requirements applied, including when crimes related to specific entities such as PI were applied. So that's coming over. There is no appetite with our board right now to have CAMs in this overarching standard, particularly since the great majority of the engagements are going to be limited right now. So I'll pause there. One last thing. This is something that comes up all the time. The one thing we've really heard throughout this process is we need guidance, more guidance. How much guidance? Like, to me, this is a balancing act. We're not trying to create another book of literature that's de facto and a standard on top of it, but we are going to support our standard. And we helped by grabbing resources associated with our TAs and our task forces and our staff to build implementation support materials. with the publication of our standards, we'll not just have the basis for conclusions, we'll have a fact sheet and implementation guidance. And then we'll go, as you see here, into further support materials throughout, in addition to webinars and other activities that we would do to help support the adoption of our standard. And in that instance, that's when we really have an opportunity to do things jointly with IAASB as well. So that's it on sustainability.
Maybe, Tom, do you want to spend 1 minute to just talk about the two, where you landed? We have seen it in our observation memo, but just where you landed on two-way communication, just because we probably want to spend a minute on that here as well.
Yes, so there was, and Billy, you could correct me if I get the technicalities wrong. So clearly we wanted an opportunity to have two-way communication at the very least at the end of the engagement, or towards the end of the engagement, when something could have a material impact on the financial statements. However, there was sort of a general unease that it was viewed as a de minimis requirement, and so we went back to the task force, as I remember, and suggested that, is there something in the planning process that there could be consideration in terms of strategy of where the appropriate moments would occur for such communications? Because there may be no impact throughout, but at least there should be a thoughtful process of thinking about that moment. Billy, did I get that right? My memory from 3 weeks ago may be a little weak.
Yeah, no, that's quite right, Tom. So what we've done is we wanted to highlight that we wanted to make sure that the assurance practitioners are alert much earlier in the process of considering the possible intersections there may be between the sustainability information and the financial statements. So we've brought this up to the planning section, where we are asking practitioners to, as Tom said, do a consideration about are there intersections where it makes sense to communicate with the auditor of the financial statements. You know, the challenge here has always been that in the responses we received on the ED, respondents raised this mostly in relation to other information, mostly in relation to the financial statements being other information published together with the sustainability information. And there was not really any indication, and we also struggled very much to think about, you know, it's one thing to say, okay, you're required to communicate with the statutory auditor, but the thing is, what are you going to communicate about? So we at least want to give that steer, that think about, are there intersections between the sustainability information and the financial statements already during the planning stage, because at that stage it may make sense to think a little bit about, you know, what is it from the sustainability information that may affect amounts and disclosures in the financial statements. That could be valuable for the sustainability assurance practitioner to have a better understanding about what items are important to the users of the sustainability information, and maybe even play into the risk assessment, because that may indicate areas where there might be a heightened risk of management bias and things like that. So we've brought that up into the standard earlier, and we still at the end also have the requirement that when you then do look at the other information, and the assurance practitioner becomes aware of any material inconsistencies, then at that point you obviously also need to communicate with the statutory auditor. Thank you, Tom.
Thanks, Billy. And maybe just while we have you on the screen, because that was one of the issues that we had as a concern, because it was initially one-way communication at the end. So it seems as if you've actually improved it to consider the need for two-way communication from both sides at certain inflection points. There was a comment in our feedback that there was a concern that there might be consequential changes needed to the other ISAs around that, or is that not something that's restrictive in how you're dealing with it for now?
I don't believe, for the purpose of 5,000, something that we have to consider. Is that, I'm pretty sure that's
no, I agree with that, Tom. I think, you know, as we go on, so certainly there won't be any amendments now flowing out of this on the ISA side. But again, I think as ISA 5000 gets implemented and the environment matures, we will probably get to a point where there would be certain amendments required on the other side as well. But as Tom said, I think for purposes of what we're busy with now, we have not anticipated any changes on the ISA side.
Okay, perfect. And thank you very much for all of this. I've got a couple of maybe just high-level feedback points from our session when we prepared for this, and then I'm going to, if that sounds okay, just take a couple of comments and questions around the room as well. So, Tom, firstly, I've already commented on Janine's point on that first that third line or third option that you've removed, which was a concern, and I think the fact that in the need to also make sure that there's alignment between you and IAASB, we're quite comfortable that that's dropped off. We saw the work that you've done, Willie spoke about the debatable assumption, but the work that you've done to clarify almost via definitions or expanding the definition on component practitioners and another practitioner and so on. So that's all good. I think generally we were fairly comfortable. It seems as if we just go through what we also thought as public interest issues, as if there's a lot of addressing that. We're not going to talk about collaboration. We've spoken about that. There were two, and it's probably more minor points, one applicable to you and one maybe just a bigger issue. And there was a question earlier on, Robert asked a question to Gabriella about the International Accreditation Forum, and maybe just if you want to talk a little bit about your thinking and your engagement and how that impacts on, you know, the work that you're doing. It might or might not be all that relevant, but maybe if you want to comment on that. The other discussion that we had, and that's a comment that I've actually made to the regulators when I had an opportunity at one stage to speak to the MG, and I believe you've also had a bit of a discussion on that, and that is the mindset of potentially having qualifications, a qualified opinion, assurance opinion, and which is a difficult mindset potentially for preparers, because preparers come from a financial statement environment, and especially at the listed environment, the last thing they want and can afford is to have that. But the benefit potentially of having qualifications, because there might be scope restrictions early, and it's almost that, how do you make assurance providers to understand, especially in this really early phases of sustainability reporting and assurance, that it is okay and it's appropriate, and that therein lies some understanding for the users to understand, you know, where does it have to go. It's probably something that's beyond the scope of the standard itself, but it probably links back into that training, awareness, understanding, and also the communication with regulators that there might be these qualifications coming out, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. Because the worst thing is if the auditor feels strongly that they have to get to a place where it's a clean opinion, but actually it's marginal or it's grey and it's not necessarily there. So those were sort of two of the points that I saw that were coming out of our discussion that we haven't really touched on yet, and it is probably a little bit larger. So if you're comfortable, Tom, I'm going to also, I just see Janine's card, I'm going to take Janine's card and then circle back to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Tom and Willie, for updating us. And I have a follow-up question, so not a comment, but it's about the component practitioner and another practitioner. The example, Willie, that you gave when you explained the proposed way forward and the rebuttable option. Is it in that example, in my mind, I got the idea that it's a sort of making use of a management expert in this other component that's part of the group, where work has been done in the sustainability area by another practitioner, but maybe it's that another practitioner should then be engaged by the component local management, is then what I assume based on the example. And I was thinking, is a group assurance provider able, and is that also being dealt with sufficiently in the standard in terms of what this group assurance provider then should do in respect to the work of this another practitioner in at the component level? Is that person able to assess based on, often components are in other jurisdictions, other legal environments, language barriers could also apply, to assess the work and whether, you know, that is all or also risk assessments, because if you're from a group level, you may not be well aware of what's happening in some other countries or what is required in the sustainability area. Think about environmental permits or some other things. So I was wondering whether this rebuttable option that cannot only be a sort of technical thing because there is another practitioner that has done some work, but is there not a risk there that is maybe not covered? That is actually my question. Thanks.
Okay. So the IAF, in fact, I meant to cover it because it was in my notes. We're lagging a little bit in terms of what IAASB did, but we're actually going through a very similar process with the IAF, particularly as it relates, the key element is in terms of quality management standards here. So very similar agreement being worked upon. It's not done yet. Obviously, it has to go to trade draft, but we certainly had, speaking of taking, drafting off of another board, we're drafted off of IAASB in this place. Very similar work has been done, and then we would have an exchange of letters and a commitment. So that is very much in hand as it relates to the quality management standards. So there was some optimism there. James, I don't know, you've been involved in this, and really, so I don't see a problem there. Engagement has been good on the substantive levels as well. In terms of the mindsets of qualified opinions, you know, anyone who's had the misfortune of listening to me in public settings, this is something I talk about quite a bit when I talk about sort of the messiness or the messiness of the early years of sustainability reporting or maturity curves and understanding what good is. Our attitude at the IAASB is that you have to comply with the standards. In the process of complying with the standards, if you have to qualify an opinion, you have to qualify an opinion, scope limitations, etc. So we're not going to tell people to do anything different than what our standards are. What I have advocated is both on a jurisdictional level and a global level is that stakeholders get together to help communicate what they think good looks like over a maturity curve. Like this has to be done with investors, regulators, practitioners, standard setters in the room, because what I don't want is people to be any less ambitious. Like over time, we want to have a trusted system of reporting on par with financial reporting. But in the near terms, there's going to be learning curves. And I think some guidance has been put out in Europe, just I think even this week in that regard. But people should just be talking about it, because otherwise we're going to have, I hate the term anyway, but well, I'll use it because we like to use it in this context, expectations gaps. And my real concern is that if people expect things to be as clean as financial reporting on day one and it turns out they're not, it may cloud people's perceptions not only of sustainability reporting but of financial reporting. And so we have to be realistic. But at the same time, it's not an excuse not to do the work. not an excuse for management to develop the appropriate systems and controls, the data quality that's going to be needed to generate clean opinions, and also the rigor by which assurance practitioners apply their work. So it will be a balancing act. I think there would be great unease if 97.9% of reports were qualified, or there were a huge scope limitations. But are we going to see probably more than we have on the financial reported side? Yes, and we should be prepared for that. But the standards have to be applied, and we should be vigilant about saying, like, there's no excuse for not complying with both the reporting and the assurance and ethics standards. And Willy, I may turn to you because you're more on top of what the task force is considering this week in terms of specific language on groups, in response to Janine's question.
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you, Tom. So on the question about when another practitioner ends up performing, when you're in a position where the sustainability assurance practitioner wants to use the work of another practitioner to obtain evidence. Janine, your question was, do we think we have covered it in terms of what the practitioner needs to do to be able to rely on that work? I think the first important thing that we have to remember when we talk about another practitioner, the difference, and it's a very important difference compared to what you will have with a component practitioner, for example. Remember, a component practitioner is always a member of the engagement team, and the component practitioner performs procedures on the engagement under the direction, supervision, and review of the sustainability assurance practitioner. Another practitioner is never a member of the engagement team and does not perform procedures on the engagement. They have performed work as part of a separate engagement, and the sustainability assurance practitioner may wish to rely on that work to get evidence for purposes of the assurance engagement. Now, the sustainability assurance practitioner has to Janine's point, has to be able to say, can I use this work to contribute to my sufficient appropriate evidence as a basis for forming a conclusion on the sustainability information. So there's nothing that says you have to use the work of a sustainability assurance practitioner. It's the option for you to leverage that work. I see, for example, in the draft of the PIOB guidance, they talk about that practitioners will do this to avoid duplication of work, for example. But the fact is still, if you cannot get comfortable with that work for whatever reasons, where it may be related to the objectivity of that practitioner, their competence, capabilities, it may be related to the actual work, you cannot get comfortable with the scope of their work, the procedures they performed, what they did matches up to the conclusions or findings they've reached, then you cannot use that work, and then you will have to either do the work yourself or use somebody else's work. We believe we have sufficient requirements for that. Referring to the June draft, it was in paragraphs 51 to 54, and included in that is also at the end of that series of requirements where we address that if the practitioner determines that the work of another practitioner is not adequate for the practitioner's purposes, then the practitioner needs to consider, where am I going to get that evidence, or does it have implications for my assurance engagement?
Thanks, Willy. Janine?
One follow-up question, Willy. So it could also be that there is still also for that particular component, how do you say that, practitioner, for maybe other topics that are relevant in the sustainability area for that component. Apart from that, another practitioner's work that's being used directly by the group assurance provider. Is that correct? It could be, because because during the March meeting, it was more like a replacement of a component practitioner, the use of another practitioner. That was based on the definition. So that is no longer the case, huh?
Yeah, I think, Janine, you're quite right. I think you could potentially end up in a situation where another practitioner performed a very discrete piece of work at a group component, and there may in any case be a component practitioner involved because of the variety of topics that will potentially be covered within the sustainability information. And remember that component practitioner, as I said before, will always be part of the engagement team, and they are under the direction, supervision and review of the sustainability assurance practitioner.
Okay, thanks, Willie. And I think if there's no more questions, let's, okay, Mark, last one, and then we need to talk about technology. Thanks.
Yeah, just picking up on that. I mean, obviously, we await to see the sort of detailed drafting on this another practitioner, but it does strike me that you know, what the board has come up with is a pragmatic approach, which will be particularly useful in the early years. And I'm thinking, you know, from a public interest perspective, of course, you know, preparers and investors are part of the public interest. And, you know, if we were to insist that, no, you can't use the work of another practitioner, you've got to do that work again, I mean, that will have a cost, which will fall on preparers and ultimately, of course, their shareholders. So, as I say, I wait to see the detailed wording, but it does strike me as being pragmatic. One thing I might add, though, is perhaps you might sort of consider materiality here, and maybe say that, you know, this approach is fine, except where, in respect of material areas where you would require the work of someone who you can sufficiently and appropriately involved in their work. So that's that point. One quick point on two-way communication. We discussed this at the board meeting, and I absolutely get that you know, changes to other auditing standards to require the financial statements auditor to communicate with the sustainability practitioners is not feasible in the timetable. I absolutely get that. I'm pleased that you know, the board is looking at introducing a requirement for the sustainability practitioner to communicate sort of from the beginning and throughout the process. The one comment that I would make, though, is I did pick up in the meeting that there was a tendency for perhaps the audit practitioners to say, oh, well, we've got to take into account client confidentiality here, and that this might, you know, create a barrier to you know, the communication. You know, I think I'd like to remind people who hold that view that ultimately the audit firm and the sustainability practitioner are working for the same client, and so hopefully, you know, ways can be found in engagement letters to get over, you know, confidentiality issues.
Thank you. And Tom, Willie, I think those were probably more broad comments. I don't know if you necessarily want to come in, Tom, and respond on that, and then we can go to technology. I'll go back to you, Tom.
No, I don't think we need to respond to it. We've taken those points on board. So should we move to technology?
Yes, thank you.
Let's get the slides on the screen. Okay. Okay, I even got the technology to work, which is appropriate right now. So I want to remind people what we're doing on this project and why we are where we are, and we'll sort of focus your expectations of in terms of the state of play for us. Remember, for the last few years, we've been engaging on this question of can this technology and disruption in technology impact audit, and how should we think about technology more broad in our standard setting activities? So we've had that ongoing work stream. We also had an audit evidence exposure draft out in the marketplace, and we got comments to say on a variety of issues, but as it relates to technology, that we really would have thought you would have been more forward-leaning on technology and technology's impact on how we think about audit evidence. We ran a strategy process where people really recommended us as a board to be leaning into the issue of technology and its impact on standard setting because of the perceived or real barriers to the use of technology and applying our standards. And when you take all of those points together, it led me and others on our board to think that we had to run an exercise to question what is our current position on technology, which has largely been that standards should not have requirements specific to technology in them, whether conditional or otherwise. And in fact, with very few exceptions, maybe 315 addresses some of it, and a little bit in ISQM1, that our tech standards have been largely, and particularly on the requirement side, silent on the issue of technology and how technological techniques, ATT, whatever we want to call it, how that can or should be applied in the context of an audit. So the first question to ask ourselves is, with all that context of those three things I said before, disruptive technology work, audit evidence, the feedback we got out of the strategy work stream, is our position correct? And remember, I used to have board members who said, it is absolutely correct that what we're concerned about is just the principles in our standard, and we need no direction in our standard about the development of technology. And so we needed to get consistency among our board of what our view is and how technology could actually be incorporated in standards if we think so, or in other elements of our toolkit. And that's sort of component one and component two that we've been working on up till this point. Because if you get agreement on that, and you could signal to the marketplace of what's going forward, then that could influence our integrated approach to audit evidence, risk assessment, and other areas of 500 among the rest of our standards. So that is what we've been trying to do. So at our June meeting, we largely were focused on the technology position statement, where we did agree as a board that we would consider what standard setting actions were necessary to reflect technology. Now, it is really important to say that we're conscious of the scalability concerns, and you'll see sort of the 7 guiding principles below. Let's not focus on the language at top. I have a desire to streamline it. But the big point is that we believe, and first of all, we start with the guiding principle, that technology can improve audit quality. They are a risk, but if appropriately managed, which is what standards help try to do, that technology could improve the quality of audit. And that standards could set the appropriate guidance and boundaries for doing that, which would then give regulatory bodies and oversight bodies more comfort that sufficient appropriate evidence is being obtained as a result of technological techniques. So we got there. The other element is that what our board is really saying, the most immediate needs, also is, can we lean a little bit more in guidance on how do you apply the existing principles, which may be right in different standards, and can we create more material on that? And remember, this is an approach that the PCAOB, to some extent, has adopted. What I would say is different is that we're more willing probably to include technological elements, whether conditional requirements or otherwise, in our standards itself. Now, we won't know exactly how that's going to play out because we have to create a roadmap for doing it. And so if you go to the next slide, it's trying to say, okay, no one's going to really care about your position statement. People want to know what the so what is, and that's where we're going from here to September with. And the first step clearly is we need to prioritize the impact on the audit evidence and risk response project. That's just a practical matter. We're going to incorporate it. The other step is rather than embedding lots of specific requirements in our standards, can we go to some foundational standards themselves, like ISQM1, about the quality of management of developing tools and techniques, so that that people believe that there's a robust process for development. And this may reflect my times in the financial services sector, where there is, like if you look at Basel and other regimes, there's a whole model risk management, model risk development process, data validation, all of that stuff occurs. And could we, building off of the framework of ISQM1, where there does have some relevance in which firms are developing practices, taking a very high level principle in QM1, could we build out quality management? So like, then regulators could say, okay, how are you thinking about the model development within your tool development in your firm, and how do we have confidence that it's being governed appropriately, validated appropriately, et cetera. So that probably is a fertile ground for that, and then we'll have to dedicate greater resources probably for guidance in this area. And when I say guidance, it could be guidance that we develop. It could be guidance that national standard setters develop in conjunction with us. And we had our national standard setter meeting in May in New York. And there's a desire for national standard setters to help participate in the development of materials. And this would be a good area in conjunction with our board and leverage more resources. So we have a dedicated staff person to this project. We actually have a fellow coming on board this month to start working with us for 18 months, specifically with a technology mandate. And we'll go into that. So, you know, if this seems unexciting for you because you say, okay, what's the impact to our work? What are you going to do? We're still developing that. But it will be clearly laid out in audit evidence in our risk response project proposal. We will start thinking about it. Particularly, I think the board agreed with our premise that QM1 with some element of 200 and 220 are probably the most fertile areas for this. That way we can remain at the principal level. We're not embedded in all the performance requirements, and forms of guidance where we can be tactical on that. So we'll probably have more to bring to this group of what the next steps are, probably at our October session. But to me, the key breakthrough is that we're not standing with our status quo position where technologies, our standards, for all intents and purposes, are agnostic on technology.
Thank you very much for that, Tom. It just struck me again the importance and the value of having these conversations, because even, you know, reading through your report and reading through your slides, there probably certain things, or there are clearly certain things that are lost on me until we have the conversation and until you talk a little bit about your thinking and your motivation, because we did have the conversation when we did our preparation on this position statement, and you know, the focus on the position statement, but it's very clear to me that it was really important to get there, and maybe, as you say, you'll clean up the wording a little bit, but it's actually part of the change management that's necessary, because out there's still very many views on whether this belongs in the ISOs, don't belong in the ISOs, it implied, what must be covered, and so on, and it is really important to first just get your excuse me, board on the same page and recognition that this is really important, and we're beyond the point where it is just implied and it doesn't, the ISOs don't need to touch on it. We spoke a little bit about almost potentially the two elements, because the one is the tools that auditors use to gain audit evidence, And therein lies fantastic opportunities, and I've seen it in, where I serve as an audit committee chair in a listed company environment, that auditors can literally audit a whole population, a whole line, the revenue line of the income statement, 100% in a way by the use of technology. So you almost don't want that efficiency that can come out of audit to be lost by not dealing with it. So there are massive opportunities, and it is important to see that and getting your board in the place where they recognize that. The other element was, but what about the technology that the client is using, and what's the impact on that in audit procedures, audit risk, and so on. And auditors do that, but the scalability point that you made is so important, and that is that maybe in the larger, the big firms, the big networks, there's audit methodology and processes and all of that very much embedded, but how do we make sure that that actually also is forefront for all auditors when it comes to the standards? So in my mind, really positive, and understanding that sometimes you have to go slow first to go far, and it seems as if that's what you're doing in bringing this in. I just want to check, there were one or two comments that we also made that I wanted to mention to you. This is obviously, and you sort of alluded to that, when whatever comes out of that and how you scope it and what work needs to be done and maybe what work won't be done by you, alludes to the very important link and collaboration, because that's a lot of work to be done on the IAASB side when it comes to some of these elements. So I think that collaboration is going to be really important. And we spoke about scalability. The other, and we were a little bit confused when we read it, and we didn't quite understand your scope and what you're focusing on, but I think your discussion certainly cleared that for me. The other related point is just, we thought about that, and we think about that when we think about our nominations, with our nominations responsibility, and just the importance of getting the right people involved in your processes. And they would probably, the real tech specialists would probably not have the appetite, the time, or the inclination to become board members, but in how you put this together, I'm sure you will also create structures to pull them into, to give you the best and the right level advice. I think those were the big comments. It's a very important project. It is, the ship has sailed on whether the ISIS or the ethics code can be silent on technology. I think that is quite clear. So I'll pause there. I will just check. I've got a couple of hands up, and then we can just get those questions if you're comfortable and respond to that. I'll start with you, Dave.
Thank you, Chair, and I'll have to look through my notes here because I don't want to repeat what you just said, and you said many of the things that I had written down as Tom was talking. But first of all, I am also very supportive of this project, and can remember a time when even I would have said, as long as the standards don't prohibit me to do research in this area and to try things, don't worry about the standards, let me worry about that. And I think it's, we're, as Linda said, we're past that point because it's pervasive. And I get the issue, the issue of scalability is an important one, and it's not, there will be haves and have-nots, so it has to take that into account. But to be silent on that in this day and age, I think, is not a good place to be. I like the way you've described the focus, including the focus on quality management in terms of the development and maintenance of those technologies, and assuring the effectiveness of those technologies, because I sometimes am concerned that that how they're described, like Linda, when you mentioned an auditor auditing 100% of revenue, I think there may be a little bit of exaggeration involved in some of the claims, that it sounds like you're auditing 100% of everything in revenue, when in fact you may be auditing certain things, or identifying certain outliers, but that isn't necessarily going to detect detect fraud or detect errors that are recorded. Linda mentioned this, but I think the focus should also not just be on the auditor's use of technology in gathering evidence, but in addressing management's use of technology, which is often far beyond that which the auditor gets. And there may be situations where not using technology could be a barrier to auditing the way management is gathering information and reporting it. So, and this is one, and I know you do this already, but this is one where understanding new technologies and developing technologies is critical as you think through this, but not focusing on any specific technology as you develop guidance or any rulemaking that you would do, I think is important, because by the time you come up with a rule, that technology will have evolved, and you don't want to spend your time addressing every potential use of technology in the audit. Thank you.
Can I take more comments? Thanks, Tom. Philippe.
Thank you, Tom, for this very clear presentation. And I share with you that technology is an area where we can expect some improvements in the quality of audit as a result. Not dreaming about 100% and perfect audit, because when it's about estimate, technology has strong limits, but anyway, I think that this domain, and in addition to that, probably the assessment of management culture is probably the areas where we could expect more quality with efficiency with regard to technology. But anyway, just a remark, Tom, regarding the presentation of your 7 guiding principles. There are 6 principles concerning, in fact, the auditing firms, activities, investment, and the use of technology. And one guiding principle, which is, on the left corner, addressing the impact on the standards of technology used by entities, which is a totally different question compared with the use of technology by audit. Because, as you say, in fact, auditors, and I think it's still the way they act, some of them, and notably smaller firms, have got around the complexity of technologies and so on by, having some more manual, I would say, some black box approach. So that means we do not look at the contents of the black box, but we look at what is, enters and what is out produced by the black box. So that allows, to some extent, to avoid some very technological audits on the tools per se. But anyway, I think that, this domain of having the appropriate approach and the feeling of risks, at client organization is totally different, because, that can raises levels of complexities, with the use of artificial intelligence in insurance, complex algorithm, and so on, which is totally different from, using technological tools in the context of an audit. So, are you, would you contemplate to separate a bit the two areas of one being the use of technological tools appropriate for the auditing firms and the investments they are doing in that area, and the specific problems raised by, you know, a technological environment at an international client, for example.
Thanks, Philippe. Janine?
Thank you. I'm very happy, Tom, to see that because in March we had this workshop at the meeting, and that this topic is progressing. I'd like to say that knowledge and understanding is very key about IT and not or technology, both at how it's used by companies that are audited, but also, of course, technology used by audit firms, because there's also the risk of over-reliance on both sides, on technology used by companies, but also the own tools that are developed. So quality management around the tools that audit firms develop is also important, and I think there is really a good hook in ISQM1 that you can use for that. But also, I think, because companies more and more use technology, and we have AI that is an upcoming thing, it also, I think, triggers things like when you're an auditor, the competence and capabilities of you as an auditor, and it has also a link to the scalability issue, and that pops up in debates around this topic often. Are you as an auditor still capable and competent enough to do it yourself? Even in relatively small companies, there is a relatively already a level of IT, and it triggers things like the general IT controls that auditors need to understand and do work on. They often need experts, IT auditors, to do that work. So the scalability issue is, I think, also something to really think through, because at a certain point in time, you cannot have these standards also with the idea that there would be an auditor doing the audit without, having sufficient competence and capabilities also as a firm to do audits that, audit companies that use technology. And I would also like to see more, actually, as outcome of this project in the standards that address the general IT controls areas, very important areas that auditors need to focus on. That's not yet reflected in the standards in that sense. And also the risk of over-reliance on both sides. And because it triggers also auditing tools, it triggers difficult questions often, like you have a lot of outliers when you use data analytical tools. What do you do as an auditor with these outliers? Do you all follow them up, or may you do some other procedures? So there are a lot of questions around the use of tools also as auditors, and I think this is a very important project, and I'm very much looking forward to where you're gonna land with this. Thank you.
Thank you, Janine. And then Robert, and back to you after that, Tom.
Thank you, Chair. And just Janine, and just in Tom, in relation to Janine's last point, just occurs to me from my public sector auditing consulting experience, there's a lot of material in the InterSci context about the use of about IT auditing and the auditing of IT controls in the public sector. So that's just a point maybe, Billy, you might want to follow up on. Yes, also very supportive of this work. Developing a position statement seems a very good way to go to really to ensure that that this is part of the ongoing health check of the ISAs, if you like, as well as providing a foundation for agile responses when they're needed. And I know, Tom, that's been a feature of your chairmanship of the board, is to be agile, but also to have the underlying basis on which you can be agile, and a framework with a strong outcome statement with supporting principles certainly seems to be a good way to proceed in an area such as this. So I just wanted to make that comment. And just another comment is in relation to the importance of working with the IAASB on this.
I know the two boards have been talking with each other about this, but of course the IAASB has been working on technology matters for a long time, and it would be helpful, I think, if that were perhaps a bit more visible in the statement and in the framework that you had on the slide, the previous slide to the one that's there now, perhaps just a recognition of the way in which ethical leadership and the exercise of professional judgment in relation to ethical leadership can actually impact on audit quality in the public interest. So the technology changes which the IAASB put into the code quite recently really focused to a large extent on the importance of professional judgment in understanding, applying, and then relying on technology in the audit process. And to go to your example, Linda, of the technological tool which can eliminate the need for sampling and can run the ruler over the entire all of the transactions, that in itself is something which the auditor needs to understand and understand the implications of, and understand what are the new points of judgment that might arise from the results of that. For example, in testing outliers in a full run across transactions. So, and then the other element which the IAASB changes were very focused on, and it was done largely at the same time as the role and mindset project with IAASB, was the importance of confirmation bias and understanding biases that can come into the use of technology. So there's a lot of underlying stuff there. It just seems to me, it's just a comment that would be helpful. So even if an auditing standard remains relatively silent on the use of technology in applying the position, those ethical requirements could still be important in driving good audit quality in the public interest, which is rightly the desired outcome that you've put in the framework. So I hope that's helpful, Chair. Thank you.
Thanks, Robert. Back to you, Tom. And then if there are any final concluding remarks from your side, then let's work that in when we can wrap up this session. Thank you.
So first of all, I appreciate the general support that I'm hearing around the table for this initiative and your understanding of why we've gone about the project in the way that we have. Right? It's really important to have made sure that everyone was to the same place as we consider the impacts of future standards. Dave, you talked about QM. To me, my mind's personal point of view, obviously the board has it, so I really think, and Janine alluded to this is probably the most fertile place for a broad, pervasive impact on standard setting beyond our audit evidence and risk response project. To me, it would be my top priority, and I do acknowledge that in QM1 we have a really good hook to build off of it. So we have to just figure out what the right way would be there, the timing of doing that. But you know, there's enough in other, as I said, I alluded to the way modeling is done in financial services sector that gives us some guidance of why that could be really fruitful. I think there's a common theme, and I should have said it at the outset, is we are looking at both the auditor's use of technology and the impact of the management's use of technology. Now, Philippe, we can't really separate them out because they have pervasive impacts, but for example, you take our risk response project, the auditor must, or our risk assessment, the auditor must understand the entity's use of technology to factor in the risk assessment and response, and that will be in it. But the key point is there's two distinct elements of it, is how entities who are being audited are using technology and what tools are being developed within the audit firms themselves. And I think you're right. So it's like, it's really hard in many instances to conceive of it audit not using technology when you're at like a very sophisticated institution who's applying technology themselves to a whole range of things. And, you know, we're putting a standard out, like fraud is an area that technological tools are being applied both within companies and outside all the time. So it's a really important conceptual distinction to make, but we'll have impacts through our standards, not necessarily in separate ways. I think the other point you made is not being specific about technologies too is also really important. The word AI only came up a couple of times in this session, and in fact, we had a discussion at our last meeting because some people are more enthusiastic to say this is really a project about AI, and I'm like, no, it's not a project about AI. Like, so, first of all, AI is not new. Companies have been using AI for years. There's a whole range of things that fit in the AI bucket, from simple natural language processing to deep neural networks. Let's calm down. Like, other things that could have an impact on technology are the application of APIs, right? If you're thinking about confirmations, APIs have a really powerful role in that. So, like, we're not being specific about technology, not being specific about individual instances of it. Yeah, Janine, I get your point on over-reliance. This is where QM may come into. In fact, I know a lot of people talk about over-reliance. I do think the ethical code plays a role too here. I forgot to say that in our position statement, we will have an allusion to ethics and the overlap here. Frankly, I think the real risk is the underuse of technology in the world of audit more than anything else. What I don't want is a world in which people are retrofitting the use of technology back into sort of a paper world to satisfy what the perceived barriers are to the use of technology. So, like, yes, I get the whole over-reliance issue. Your scalability point actually makes these sort of counterpoint too, is that all firms at some point are going to have knowledge and expertise on technology. And they're going to be in some instances, you're going to probably need to use technology to actually perform the requirements of our standards, whether they stand today or not. And Robert, I think your points, I just note them. As I said, we were planning on incorporating an element of ethics into our position statement, and that's taken as a given and should be more explicit up front. So I hope that is responsive on technology. More to come on this phase. I think this is one of the more exciting areas that we're in and should have long-lasting impacts. And in general, you know, I think that the board is in a really good position on finishing our big three standards and then thinking about where do we go from here on technology, risk response, and audit evidence, among others, projects. And, you know, one other thing I would say is that this also, as those big three go out and firms are implementing those standards on top of ISQM, 600, 315 still, like all of the standards that we've done over the recent years, maybe they need some time to take a deep breath after that, and we need to get this right. And so I just think that's where we get to the inflection point, that we're able to do some more strategic choices, though I think the projects we've done are quite strategic, but give sense to support the implementation of those standards, which will be our goal. That we'll start going to post-implementation reviews of the standards that we put out, and then we'll get audit evidence and risk response right. And that's really important to us. So thank you.
Thank you very much for that, and this was a really useful and interesting discussion for us as well. It is important, as we said, and good luck to your board, Tom, Willie, in taking this one forward as well. We at the end of